Hello, everybody. We're letting some people in, so give us a minute, and then we will get moving. Thank you, everyone who has shown up today for our Menopause 201 session. I'm really excited to have you here, and I'm super excited because we have some real expertise for you all tonight in a subject that we probably don't learn nearly enough about in med school. So I am thrilled to introduce the host of tonight's session. I'll stay on the session and be around for any questions that apply to me. But the host of tonight's session is Stasi Kasianchuk, who is a registered dietitian nutritionist, also an exercise physiologist, and is their head of lifestyle care here at Geneva. And I am going to pass it over to her to take control of the session. So Stasi, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for joining. This is an exciting opportunity for Beth and I to dive deeper into one of our areas of our work related to exercise physiology and the functionality of muscle building and how it relates to the body changes that are happening in the peri to post-menopause transition. Just a little bit of background on myself. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm an exercise physiologist, also a registered dietitian. And my background has been in college athletics and sports nutrition. And then over the past 5 years, have started working closely with Rebecca in terms of providing peri to postmenopausal lifestyle nutrition care. And one thing I have found to be really helpful is that exercise physiology lens has helped me in better understanding the impact of hormonal changes on the body. And tonight we're going to focus more on the muscle aspect and how that impact, how those changes happen during that period postmenopause transition, and then how we, as practitioners from our lens, help our patients to implement the lifestyle changes and the lifestyle strategies to support the overall the health benefits that we all know are important, but can sometimes be the hardest part to implement. So, as for you all as clinicians yourselves, we're going to take a deeper dive than perhaps we may in a session with the patient, or if this was a consumer-facing webinar. And so we do welcome your questions throughout the session. We'll also leave some time at the end. And Rebecca did mention, while I am pseudo-host, I guess, in one sense, Beth and I have more of a conversation planned tonight to be able to help dive a little bit deeper and help you understand the things that we think about in this realm. So before we dive in, I'm going to turn it over to Beth to provide an introduction to herself and her background, and then we'll get going on our conversation.
Great. Thanks, Stacey and Rebecca. Thanks everyone for hopping on, and those of you who are watching the replay of this. This is fun because this is kind of my passion area. My background initially is exercise physiology. I have an exercise science degree, and that's really where I started in the health field, and working in corporate wellness and community wellness, and then quickly realized how important the nutrition piece was in conjunction with the exercise piece. So like Stacey, I spent much of my career in college athletics, high school athletics, professional athletics, working with highly active individuals, and also doing a little bit of corporate wellness as well, and have since transitioned to working with Geneva, and working with women really at all different stages of life, but focusing on peri and menopause women and helping them to stay active and hopefully understanding some of the physiological changes that are happening in their body and how to work with them rather than against them. So thank you for having me. Excited for the conversation.
Great. So to get us started, one thing as Beth and I were preparing this and talking about the research that's out there, we recognize that when it comes to exercise science research, it can be different than some of the medical science research that's out there, just in terms of how it's conducted. So one thing we want to acknowledge as we are talking about this in terms of the research and the data that's out there is there are some limitations, and it does certainly require the synthesis of information for that evidence-based practice that we all do in our day-to-day in terms of taking the information in our clinical experience, but to level set a little bit on the exercise science area area. One of the things that we recognize are some limitations in this research is some of the difficulties in recruiting and conducting this research. And with that, a lot of the research that we see is done in settings that we have to use the information to translate. So while in preparing for this, we certainly did look for a lot of the research in the peri to postmenopausal individuals, and thankfully there's more coming with that. We don't have the bulk of research that we want to have, and so a lot of times we are using the data that's available. We'll address where some of those gaps may be, and then how we're implementing our clinical experience to make the recommendations that we do. The other piece I'll also call out that you all have more expertise in, and we're seeing not all exercise scientists, and I would say many, don't have the understanding of hormones that you all do. We do have Rebecca on the call tonight to answer some questions if there's areas that we need to fill in the blanks, but sometimes that also influences the data that we have because the hormone or hormone therapy component may not have been accounted for as accurately or to the level that you all on the call know those things. And so those are some of the limitations. I don't think it limits the recommendations that we're going to provide and the evidence around that for our patients, but wanted to level set in terms of some of the differences with some of the exercise science research that's out there. So diving into some of the components that we know related to changes in the perimenopause transition, we know that sarcopenia, so that loss of muscle mass, happens. Beth, when we're thinking about this with our patients, and maybe what would be helpful to start with is just that definition of sarcopenia. How do you think about that, and what is the breadth that covers for you as you're considering that working with the patients that we do?
So sarcopenia is essentially a loss of muscle mass, and oftentimes I think people associate that with aging or inactivity, which it really can be both. So when we have loss of muscle mass, there's lots of different things that happen physiologically with that loss of muscle mass. There's obviously lack of strength or loss of strength, which really can impact people's ADLs or activities of daily living, how they function in the world of, getting their groceries in the house, picking up children or grandchildren, doing gardening, carrying things in and out of the basement. Those things that are just part of our everyday life can become more challenging. And when that happens, we are looking at typically maybe some increased risk of falling, maybe some balance issues, some challenges navigating some of those situations of getting in and out of the shower, or, as I said, taking the groceries in. And so with that, of course, comes decreased quality of life. So, our goal is to help our patients to have a high quality of life, to be living not just longer, but in a healthy way, and have that longevity piece and be active and engaged in life. So with the sarcopenia, you have the decreased muscle mass, which often is associated with changes in muscle fiber. And so with that, again, like I said, is decreased strength, decreased function, decrease ability to do activities of daily living. And then, of course, if they happen to be someone who's active or athletic in any type of fashion, whatever that looks like for them, those type of activities may get harder. So they may see decreased ability to ride their bike, or to, hiking gets more difficult, or swimming or things like that get more difficult because of the decrease in muscle mass. And of course, this is related to lots of different things. Sarcopenia is a function to some degree of aging, but also low activity level. We see this happen with hormonal changes, which is a population, of course, we're working with a lot, and then chronic diseases. One of the other things that we see as impactful in this particular population with women is that often they are not consuming adequate calories and adequate protein. So the muscle mass loss is accelerated due to maybe the aging or inactivity. And then we throw in some hormonal shifts and then inadequate calories and protein, which we're going to talk a little bit about tonight, can kind of make this like a runaway train and gets harder to just function in life and be able to do the things that our patients want to do in a normal, healthy, functioning way, and can get very frustrating. So they get injured. Things are more painful or more difficult to do, and it can then become a vicious cycle for women. So that sarcopenia is really just essentially the loss of muscle mass that is occurring in the body.
Thanks, Beth.
And do you want to talk about the menopause piece, Stacey?
Yeah, let's one thing to come back to I think was really interesting because what you captured there especially is the downstream effects of that sarcopenia. That at one point, or at the start of it, it's just this loss of muscle mass, but then the wide stream effect, and that is where we as the clinicians often start to have to look at the bigger picture of it's not just loss of muscle mass, but what are all the impacts. The one thing before we go into the menopause and sarcopenia piece that you mentioned that I think would be worth diving a little bit deeper in is the change in muscle fiber types. And so one of the things that we had come across as we were preparing is the specific reduction in those fast twitch muscle fibers. Can you go into those, what they are, and then why those are important as well?
We essentially have, if we're simplifying it down, we essentially have like two different types of muscle fibers. It's kind of a little bit more complex than that, but essentially we have fast twitch, which are the muscle fibers that really are activated in speed work, things that are related to power, strength, sports that are very quick in duration. So sprinting, whether it's running or swimming or jumping, short duration activities tend to rely more on fast twitch muscle fibers. And so sometimes, we're all born with certain muscle fibers, and some may genetically have more fast twitch and some may genetically have more slow twitch. We can certainly develop those, but we're also born kind of with a predisposition towards one or the other. So we've got the fast twitch, and then we also have the slow twitch, and slow twitch is often associated with more endurance activities. So people who have more slow twitch muscle fibers will be better long distance swimmers and runners, bikers, be able to do more endurance activity easier. And as I said, we can train our body to maximize our muscle fibers, but we also have a predisposition towards having more of one versus the other. So we do notice in this sarcopenia, we have a shift in the fast twitch muscle fibers, more so necessarily than the slow twitch muscle fibers. And that can come into play and be important when we're talking about what are some of our recommendations, which we'll get into in a little bit. So that's kind of why that piece is important, because it will impact some of the overall things that we recommend to help our athletes our patients, if they are hitting a plateau, and what can we recommend to help get past that plateau will be related to the muscle fiber loss overall.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, I think that's a great piece. And you'll all notice, once a sports dietitian, always a sports dietitian. Everyone's an athlete in life trying to perform.
Yeah, that's what I feel like. Everybody is an athlete. We're all performing life, whether you're going for a walk or riding your bike or sitting or on the Peloton. We're all athletes.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah, I think that muscle fiber type thing is key, as like you said, as we're going into these other recommendations. And I think it's something that our patients certainly don't understand. Sometimes maybe don't need to, but as we think about what we're asking them to do, and during this phase of peri to post-menopause, again, it can tie into the specificity of some of those recommendations, thinking about the types, which is even outside of the hormone piece, but where we could provide some support there. Yeah, let's next go into a deeper level on, okay, now menopause and sarcopenia. So we've talked about sarcopenia as in general. What are the things we're thinking about from a menopause perspective that stand out to you?
So, obviously, one of the first things we see are hormonal shifts, right, with menopause, the decrease in estrogen. And estrogen is really helpful in maintaining muscle mass. So, obviously, when you have a decrease in estrogen, you're going to likely have a decrease in muscle mass. Plus, you may have some of the natural aging that's occurring that happens just naturally in everyone. So, with the decrease in estrogen, causing some of the decrease in muscle mass, then what also can happen is an increase in body fat percentage. So, one reason why our scale weight doesn't tell the whole picture of our health is it doesn't really discriminate between body fat and muscle mass. And we know that muscle mass is very metabolically active. It uses a lot of calories. It keeps us going throughout our life, our world. It helps everyday activities, and being active makes it easier to do that. Whereas body fat can, a high level can increase our risk for chronic diseases, and help slow down our metabolism. So that increase in body fat and decrease in muscle mass, which is often caused by some of the shifts in estrogen, are some of the things that we see in our patients at this stage of life. And so it's often a shift in metabolism, and we hear this all the time. I mean, it's something I hear probably, I want to say almost 100% with every patient is, I'm doing what I've always done and it's not working anymore. All of a sudden, it's shifted and I'm gaining weight, or my clothes aren't fitting the same. And that's often, due to shifts of hormones, and the fact that they haven't shifted anything. They're confused, they're frustrated. They're like, this has always worked for me and now it's not working anymore. And so often what happens is, we know, working with women who are having shifts in hormones and at that stage of life, is they're often juggling lots of different things. Time constraints, maybe they're parenting, they're caught in a sandwich generation, they're caring for their own parents or other family members, they have work responsibilities, they may have a history of some injuries, so they're not as active as they used to be, they're not sleeping as well due to hormonal fluctuations, they're tired, they're stressed, they have lots of different things going on, and it kind of can snowball from there. So the decrease in muscle mass, which is caused by the decrease in estrogen, and then of course leading to the increased body fat, can then snowball and become, this whole ball of wax, so to speak, of like lots of different things going on. And it becomes like, where do we start and what do we start with? And they're often frustrated because their body has changed and they're confused and not understanding why. And so I think these are things we, as the RD team, we hear a lot, and you probably hear a lot too. There's a lot of frustration in this and the confusion about what to do overall.
Yeah, and I think that's, where the role, there's these hormone shifts and it's multifactorial. And I think this also shows where this is difficult to study. And we know that there's a role that estrogen may be playing on the muscle, given some of the physiological mechanisms and the signaling as a hormone, and knowing that there's receptors on the muscle, and what are all the other factors that are at play. So I'm going to pull up a little graph right here. If I can share screen, let's hope that works. And this is something we do use as an education tool, but I think it's pertinent tonight, as really capturing some of the things that Beth just mentioned. And so this isn't exhaustive. Beth, can you see this? So I know, because I can't see if I'm sharing or not. Okay. So not exhaustive by any means, but when we talk about these body changes in menopause, and we can think about all of these things as well relating to those changes in muscle. So we do have a decrease in muscle mass contributing to those body changes. As Beth described, our patients are saying, my clothes fit differently. And sometimes that is a change in the muscle itself, because that's part of our mass. Other times, maybe it's that redistribution of body fat that we know a lot of people talk about at their abdomen. Genetics certainly is going to play a role in fiber types, as we talked about, muscle fiber types, the potential you have for gaining or even losing muscle. So that's going to play a role. And then we have a lot of these other factors, life transitions. Beth mentioned changes in stress, changes in hormones. And so, tonight we're thinking about the main hormones that we see changing in peri to post-menopause and talking about that estrogen change as the predominant one. But certainly there's other hormones at play here that can change in this transition and with aging that are going to be a contributing factor as well. So with this multifactorial approach, we know that nothing's happening in isolation. So it's important to keep all of that in mind. But absolutely, there's the hormone change during this transition, and what we hear from our patients is something that we're thinking about. And then that informs how do we then think about strategies to impact those changes with the idea of focusing on maintaining and, if possible, putting on muscle mass. It's harder to do when you are I don't like the term fighting, but working against some of these natural processes of aging and the menopause transition. It's harder to do, but with intention and with applying exercise physiology and exercise science that we do know, there is ways to mitigate that change. I'm going to stop sharing right there. I'm going to pause. We've thrown a lot of information out at you all in the last 20 minutes. I'm going to just see if there's any questions before we continue. Because I can't, there is the chat. Let's see.
I can see the chat.
You can see the chat? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. We will.
Nothing yet.
Nothing yet. Okay. Beth, what are, and these are the things, like, regardless of who you are, if we're going to build or maintain muscle, and I know you and I have shared these things from younger athletes all the way to older adults, what are the things that we need to make that happen?
So I think, we chatted about this and we really narrowed this down to like 3 key things. And of course, there's individual differences in people, their genetic makeup, their needs, their lifestyle, all of that kind of stuff. But really the 3 key things overall are optimal calories, like getting adequate calories to fuel their body. And this is something I think I see quite often is under fueling and restricting. And that can come from a history of dieting mentality, confusion about what to do, maybe thinking like if I'm not losing weight or changing my body composition with this number of calories, then less has got to be better, and then keep lowering and lowering, and then all of a sudden, they're really under fueling. So having optimal calories is really important. I think there's like a happy medium. There's like, over fueling is not going to help them towards their goals, and under fueling is not either. So that's the first thing. The second thing is optimal protein intake. I think like protein is kind of getting its moment right now, so we're just kind of go with it. Like the other macronutrients, carbohydrate and fat, protein is very important. And I always say, like, it's kind of like players on a team or components of a book or something. Like, one of them is not necessarily more important than the other. They all work together. But in this situation, when we're talking about building and maintaining and building muscle mass, we need to have optimal protein as well. And that is calculated based on an individual's body weight and their particular goals. So there are some recommendations that we can give patients related to their lifestyle and their goals and their body weight about what their protein intake optimally would look like. And then the third part of this is some type of resistance training. And that looks different for each person. I think right now we're hearing so much information about lift heavy and wear a weighted vest and, do HIIT classes and do this and do that. And there's, much like everything we discuss with patients, there's not a one size fits all approach. If you've got a patient who has not been doing any resistance training, then doing some body weight squats is going to be resistance training. And so we start with, that kind of individual recommendations, but the overall goal is some type of resistance on the muscle in order for it to grow and get stronger. So the keys are the adequate calories, optimal protein, and some type of resistance training for the muscles.
Thanks, Beth. And I think those are always, when we're thinking about fundamentals, and and thank you for bed today, we hear all this, I'll call it a little bit of noise, or there's all these recommendations out there of you got to get a weighted vest. And if you're not doing high intensity, high weights exercises, like you might as well sit on the couch, I sometimes feel like is the message that ends up coming from these things. And I see we even have a question here. Is low weight and high reps okay for maintaining muscle? I tend to get injured if I use high weights. And I think some of those one size fits all approach can have that. There's these unintended consequences. And I agree. There's some individuals, and both Beth and I, with credentials and certifications as personal trainers, you always want to make sure that the first thing is that people are safely executing exercise. That we all know here that none of this is going to provide the benefit we want it to if someone can't actually do it for the rest of their life. And so if you are getting injured doing the exercise, then there does need to be a reevaluation of what is specific for you. So certainly lower weights and higher repetitions can be beneficial for maintaining muscle. The key that I always think when we have that appropriate resistance training as that third key or that third pillar to building and maintaining muscle, does have to be challenging to some extent. So even if you're looking to maintain, like it's the catch-22 of improving any aspect of fitness, once you've improved your fitness, if you want to maintain that or improve it, you have to up the challenge in some way. So you can continue with low weight and high repetitions, but it's going to have to be either more weights and continued with that same number of repetitions that you can do safely, or more repetitions in some way to continue to challenge the muscle. So, physiologically, that challenge has to be there. And I will say that is something, especially with individuals who come to the menopause transition and perhaps have never really done any type of resistance training or intentional exercise. Knowing where the challenge is appropriate, you want it to be challenging but doable and not painful, can be a hard piece to educate on. And we'll talk about some resources that we would recommend. But I think that's the piece where it can be a little bit more challenging, and we're often having to use our expertise around that to help patients understand, yes, doing something is good, and you want to start with what's safe and comfortable. And as you do improve your fitness, that challenge does have to increase in some way, shape, or form, and there's different variables to do that. Beth, is that the approach you're using with your patients as well? Anything I'm forgetting there?
No, I mean, I think much like the medical field, I think our patients are led to believe there's like a one path for everybody. And this is coming, I think, mostly from social media, that everybody should do these, things. And the reality is our patients are all very different. They're coming in with different needs, different access to equipment or not equipment, living in different places, having different experiences with exercise and activity, having different body sizes, having, maybe not feeling comfortable in certain clothing. And, everybody's coming in with their own stuff. And that's normal. And so the goal is to help them figure out what will work for them. And my key is always the consistency piece. Like whatever we're aiming to do, we want it to be consistent. And what can we do that will be consistent, even if it doesn't fit in within like the recommendations that they're hearing on social media or an influencer, and they feel badly that they're not doing those top 5 things, but they're doing something else consistently, then that's then that's what we've got. That's progress, and that's a positive thing to be focusing on. So I think it's helping them weed through, like, the information that's out there too, and understanding that some activity is better than no activity. And yes, there are some optimal things to be doing, but if they don't work for them in their lifestyle, then we've got to make some modifications and we've got to roll with that, so to speak. So obviously we're recommending optimal, strength training, but that doesn't always work for everybody.
Well, let's dive into some examples here and the fit principle concept, because I think that will help to also understand the variables that we think about in what can we manipulate to help our patients progress that challenge. So can you give the fit principle defined for everyone?
So I love this principle because I think it helps people to understand what the variables of activity are. And it's FITT. So it's the word fit with another T. And this is a principle in the exercise science world that helps to describe or give information about what are the variables of activity that we can control. And so when a patient comes and says to me, I walk 2 to 3 miles, I've been doing this, every day for 2 years. I go with my neighbor, we walk, these 2 to 3 miles every morning, and I'm gaining weight, nothing's changing, I'm not sleeping well, I'm not getting stronger, then that's when I can pull out the FIT principle. So the first, the acronym is, the first one is frequency. So how often are you doing an activity, and what is recommended, what is optimal for that particular activity? So I'll kind of go through them. Frequency. The next one is intensity. How difficult is it? How hard is it? Is this a casual stroll? I like to say, like, sometimes I like to go for a walk, and sometimes I like to have my dog just do the sniffing kind of walk. So is he sniffing every flower, every leaf, every, chasing every squirrel, or am I like walking fast, or am I running? Those are different intensities. The next is the type. What is the type of activity? So if you've got somebody who is walking all the time, can they mix up the type of activity? Can they maybe walk, run? Can they walk on an incline? Can they maybe do a swim workout or a bike workout, or change that type of activity? And then the last variable is time, or how long they're going for. So again, if I'm always going for a 20-minute walk, could I bump it up to a 35-minute walk? Could I change, make so some days are longer and some days are shorter? And so these are ways, like, you don't have to constantly be changing everything, but they're variables that give people maybe some ability to not only get a little creative and have a little more fun and diversity in their workouts, but have a little bit more maybe success in meeting their goals, because they're not doing the same thing all the time. So this encourages that whole aspect of cross training, of some days are harder, some days are easier, some days you might go a little longer, some days are a little shorter. You mix it up and do different activities. Stacey likes to say this, and I completely agree, is your body gets really efficient at what you're doing. So if you're doing the same thing all the time, your body's going to get really efficient and really good at it. And eventually you're not going to quite see the same results anymore, which is why you need to mix it up and then do something different. So that FIT principle is something that the variables that we can use to help people get more out of their activity. And also, I think, I'm someone who enjoys activity. It allows you to experience different things, maybe try different things you wouldn't try, because all in the name of some diversity and some differences in a workout.
Excellent. Thanks, Beth. Yeah, there's different factors there that can allow for us to figure out what's going to work best for the patient. With the thinking about the intensity piece, this could be, I think, a good one to dive into and circle back to the the level of resistance training. So if we are thinking about resistance exercises, weightlifting, as one to benefit muscle, that's not the only thing that can benefit muscle. There certainly can be a variety of exercises. Anytime you're moving your body, you're using your muscles. However, for many people, that translates well in understanding, okay, lifting weights is a muscle building, muscle maintaining activity. Let's go into a little bit on the intensity question, the intensity part of it. I think it would be interesting to share some of the data that we found on related to just aging in general and high intensity exercises. And this is for males and females, but where that could be beneficial and tie that back to those fiber types that we had talked about as well. And then maybe talk about the pros and cons for thinking about these types of exercises at that intensity for certain individuals. Lots of things there, but we can work
that was a lot.
together. Yeah.
Holy cow. Yeah. Well, let's start with the intensity piece. I mean, I think the intensity piece is always a discussion about what is personally going to be intense to that individual. So you always start with where the patient is at and meet them where they're at, based on, their goals, their health history, their injuries, their fitness level, all of that. So if you've got somebody who, I have a patient right now who she regularly competes in half marathons, and that's something she regularly does, and she's competing, she's training hard. And then I also have people who have not been for a walk in the last year. So kind of the whole gamut. And so intensity for each of those different patient populations is going to be very, very different. So I think like the key is meeting them where they're at and then doing a little bit more than what they're doing. And that would be upping their particular intensity. So I think, one of the confusing messages right now is this whole concept of HIIT and needing high intensity, short duration, really get your heart rate up, type activities being beneficial for women as we age. And certainly there may be, I think jury's still totally out on, is that really what we need or not? I think there's not as much research as we probably would like. But the bottom line is that might work for some people. And then for other people, it's so far beyond what their normal everyday activity would look like that they may just hear that recommendation and say, well, forget it. I can't do that. So I'm not doing anything. So I always like to use the concept of, any activity is better than no activity. So even if if somebody's not doing anything and they do a 7-minute walk, or they walk to the end of the driveway and back 3 times in a day, that's more activity than what they were doing. That might not always be enough to help them towards their goals of building muscle or losing body fat, but it's progress in a positive direction of helping their overall health and, starting to build their fitness. So that type of intensity is going to be very different than somebody who's going to high intensity boot camp type class. And we see all ends of the spectrum on them on this. So I think it's really looking at this individually and meeting the patient where they're at and then progressing from there. So that's kind of the initial part of it, I would say.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. And I think that's where that's the art and the science, right? When we get these, and even
100%.
recommendations from some of the research. So some recommendations that are out there from smaller, albeit smaller studies that have been done. So some that have been done on men and women do look at the need to have a higher intensity of resistance training to get the benefits to the muscle. And in the exercise science world, when we're looking at resistance training, it's a term used, 1 repetition maximum. So you find what you can do for one heavy weight lifting, and whether it's a squat or a bench press, and then you take a certain percentage of that. And so there is some data to say that 70 to 85% of this repetition max for done 2 to 3 times per week can be beneficial. It shows the benefit for building and maintaining muscle during in individuals older than 50. Now, what I'm going to back up and say is like, okay, that's out there, but now to Beth's point is that person that's never walked for the last year or gone out on an intentional walk, that is absolutely not an appropriate exercise for them. And their 70 to 85% repetition max is going to look a lot different. And most likely they may not have access or the comfort or the fitness level to perform that exercise. So we have to take that recommendation that's out there and recognize, okay, how do we get this individual who's certainly going to benefit from some type of resistance training, but it's going to look a lot different to make sure that they're benefiting their muscles. And so I think that's something for us to all to think about. Again, it comes back to that individual patient. And I always come back to what is challenging for them. So at the basic level, if we need to challenge the muscle, how is that going to be challenging for the patient? And something we often use also in exercise science is rate of perceived exertion, a 0 to 10 scale. It's similar to a pain scale, right? We don't want them to be in pain, but we want them to be, have a relative challenge level, usually say between a 7 and an 8. It's something that's challenging but doable, but not so extreme that they're going to feel like they're going to get hurt or injured or be in too much pain to be able to do it. So those are some tools as well to help with that intensity piece. But it certainly is a synthesis of the information that we have out there, and then how do we adapt that to the individuals that we're working with. All right. Well, let's see, I'm keeping track of the time here. So let's go into, we have some time for questions. Let's dive into the nutrition piece. So we touch on that protein component and adequate calories. I think that's really an important piece, especially as Beth mentioned, we do see in this population individuals more often than not with intention to improve their health, and really having that messaging that, okay, I need to eat less to lose weight, or I need to eat less carbohydrates. We often hear, I need to eat less sugar. And such a focus on less that unintentionally they are compromising other things. And I think the message around having adequate calories in order to build muscle, because remember, from a physiological standpoint, building muscle and even maintaining is an anabolic process. And that breakdown, when we don't have enough of the material to do that, is a catabolic process. And we want to make sure there's adequate energy necessary for that anabolic process to take place. And providing the nutrition to do that is really important. So let's dive into that before we take some questions. Beth, where do you start with as you're assessing patients and helping them understand the adequate calories part? Because that can be a hard one to get buy into.
I mean, obviously it's kind of, in some ways it's complicated, in other ways it's not. Looking at, we do a thorough assessment of what does a typical day look like? What are foods that you may be eating frequently? Obviously we get into things like stress and sleep and that kind of stuff. But when you hear someone, you kind of go through like what a typical day looks like, what foods that they typically eat, and you hear them, talk about, well, I don't eat these certain foods, or I eliminate these, or I've stopped eating this. Kind of pick up on some of those cues and maybe ask some more questions. Tell me a little bit more about that. And sometimes it's related to, it's a food they don't care for. Sometimes it's a food they're avoiding because they perceive to be a health benefit for avoiding that food. Sometimes it's, part of a restriction or a diet that they've done in the past. And I think, many of you probably may see this as well. A lot of our patients come in and they've done lots of different eating plans in the past, and maybe even struggled with their relationship with food. And so, part of our work is to help them fuel adequately and have a healthy relationship with food, which really means fueling throughout the day. I always, tell patients this means like taking your caloric needs and kind of spreading it throughout the day. So you're eating breakfast, lunch, dinner, and maybe a few snacks. that it's not clustered into, afternoon snack and dinner and nighttime, or all in the morning, or just in the middle of the day, but it's spread throughout the day and optimally fueling the body so that it gets food throughout the period of the day. And that those meals are balanced, that there's some protein at each meal, depending on needs. I think a good range of needs for people is around 20 grams of protein per meal and 10 to 15 per snack, again, depending on the individual. So spreading that protein intake out, aiming for high fiber foods like fruits and vegetables. I think one of the things I see a lot is the patients who are already doing all of that, but they've really eliminated carbohydrates. They're not eating things like rice or potatoes or crackers because there's a perception that they don't need them, or they're not healthy, that's a way of cutting back on calories. And sometimes, I'll use the example of my I almost said athlete again, because she is an athlete, my patient who trains regularly for half marathons, and she's got a triathlon coming up. She was very much under fueling for her activity level and under fueling carbohydrates particularly. So, we started to add in some carbohydrates in addition to her protein and her fruits and vegetables and stuff, but she's very active and she wasn't getting optimal carbohydrates. So she wasn't recovering from her workouts and she didn't have the energy to put into her runs and her strength training sessions. So she was kind of caught in this vicious cycle. So we do find like sometimes there are people who are focusing so much on a certain nutrient or certain type of food that something else falls off the radar. And that whole adequate calorie thing can really be described. I don't know, Stacey, if you want to pull up that
I was
graph.
just gonna grab the. There we go.
A great visual for those of you who may be familiar with the concept of REDS, which is it's called relative energy deficiency, and it's kind of this concept has started in the world of sports or active people, in the world of athletics, but it pertains to anybody who's active. And that relative energy deficiency is essentially when your intake of food doesn't match your output. So the output is higher than the intake. And some people may think, well, that's great. That's how weight loss occurs. But if that gap is too big, that's when we start to see lots of systemic challenges. And this graph shows all of the different areas that long-term low energy availability or relative energy deficiency can affect. It affects brain function, it affects muscle growth, it affects cardiac function, it affects sleep, stress, so many different systems of the body. That, when we see people who are really, really under fueling, and even if they're not super active, but they've just got such a big gap, they're often not meeting their goals and they're struggling and they're frustrated and they're wondering, why is my body not changing? Why am I not losing weight? I'm not getting stronger. And they're kind of just, I say, like you're spinning your wheels in sand. You're just not going anywhere. And this is such a great visual to show the impact on really having too few calories on an ongoing basis. We got some good questions here.
Good questions here. Yeah. Do you want to take the intermittent fasting or maybe since we're talking about the REDS, do you want to take the REDS one? And then we'll go back to intermittent fasting.
Yeah, good question about overlap of REDS with orthorexia. So orthorexia, as far as I know, it doesn't have a strict criteria yet, but it's really a focus on being overly healthy, like the health of food. So it's not necessarily focused on a certain body weight or restricting intake to get to a body weight, like maybe, anorexia would be, or bulimia has very strict criteria of what the diagnostic criteria is. With REDS, it's often a result. I mean, it may be in relationship to wanting to improve performance or health, but it's a result of that low energy availability over a period of time that it may not necessarily be focused on the health of the food. It's just that the overall intake is low. So orthorexia could be kind of merged into reds. It kind of could get very blurry for sure. And I think we see this in individuals who are highly focused on, my food is quote unquote clean. I always kind of laugh at that because I'm like, are you like spraying it with a cleaner and wiping it down? Which, of course, that's not what they mean. But to us dietitians, that word is a little bit of a red flag of like, okay, there are no foods that are like the good foods and the bad foods. There's all foods can fit. It's how do we navigate them? So when somebody comes in and they're talking about the food being clean or organic, or I only eat these certain foods, sometimes that throws up some red flags for us of there may be some restriction going on, whether it be the orthorexia piece or the relative energy deficiency, or maybe even a clinical eating disorder. Could be any or all of those types of things. Stacey, I'd love for you to chime in there too.
Yeah, I think there's definitely blurring of the lines. Like you said, there could be some overlap. The relative energy deficiency can sometimes be unintentional. I think a lot of times people are thinking I'm doing the right thing and they actually don't realize there may not be intentionally restricting, but it just happens. Or a lot of times what we could see too with that intention of expending calories through exercise or just wanting to enjoy movement. Some people really do just enjoy the training and they want to do more of it, and they're expending more calories than they realize, and they're not able to keep up with the intake. And that's where, and then orthorexia can certainly kind of muddy the waters if there is a level of just overemphasis on health or some fear related to that could widen that gap of that energy deficiency. Yep, great question. All right, so the intermittent fasting question. This was we could do a whole other session on intermittent fasting, especially what we've seen in our patients and what Beth and I certainly have seen in our career around intermittent fasting for sure. So comment on intermittent fasting specifically for athletes. Beth, you want to start with that one? Like, where do you see, like, when especially our active patients are like, hey, I'm doing intermittent fasting. What is where do you go with that?
Well, if they're doing that, I always say, is this working for you? Like, let's start there. Is this something you feel like is working for you? And they're often not sure. But then we start to like put the pieces of the puzzle together. Like, how's your energy? How are you sleeping? How's your performance? How are you doing on your bike? How are you feeling in the weight room? How are the injuries? We start to kind of put some of those pieces together. Are you meeting your goals when it comes to either performance or body weight or whatever your particular goals are? And if they're not, if they feel like it's working for them, then, my goal is to maximize their fueling in that time period. I'm not a huge fan. I don't think it works great for most athletes. I think, depending on the level of training and depending on, how much they're doing, the timing of what they're doing, it's often difficult to get adequate calories in throughout the day. And then if you shorten that window and then you've got sleep time, a short window of eating, time when they're not able to eat because they're training, then it becomes very, very difficult to get all their needs in to fuel for their activity and recover to kind of get everything done all at once. So I'm not necessarily a huge fan of it. I also think sometimes people use it as a kind of way of restricting and do it in a more socially accepted way because it's intermittent fasting and it sounds kind of cool and trendy. But I more encourage people to like, let's look at your day and like, how can we go into your day fueled? How can we recover? How can we fuel for the next thing? How can you not go too long without meals so you're overly hungry, which then leads to maybe overdoing it later, and then gets into this binge purge cycle. And how do we keep things consistently going throughout the week so it's not like, oh, you do this Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and by Friday it's all gone out the window and we're on this chaotic, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and we're back to it on Monday. So personally, I'm not a huge fan, especially with athletes. But if somebody is adamant that this is what's working for them, I'll try to do my best with working within the constraints that they have, while maybe trying to drop some little seeds of information and ways that we could potentially enhance things a little bit. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Stacey.
No, that's my same piece, especially with the active individuals. When you're accounting for that activity, the intermittent fasting makes things challenging. And what can sometimes do is I often offer an experiment for that individual that's like, no, I think this is working. I want to keep doing it. Let's try an experiment. Let's try fueling before a workout and see how you feel, especially if that intermittent fasting window is prior to a workout, or add in some recovery after the workout and see how you feel and get that comparison. And I would say 9 out of 10 times they come back and they say, I feel so much better. Like my workout wasn't like, it was actually kind of enjoyable. And so I think that some of the things there that, again, if we're going to make this long term, if you're not feeling good in your workout, you're not going to want to do it for a long time. And if you want to set yourself up for success, we do want, workouts like we talked about to get benefits, often should feel challenging, but it shouldn't feel unnecessarily hard. And going into workouts fasted makes them unnecessarily hard. So that could sometimes be a good experiment to help people understand the connection of that fueling and being strategic. We're not talking about if you have, a 45-minute run or cardio or even weight training session that you're, having a steak dinner and potatoes and, a basket of bread before. But like, let's think about what the body needs. Let's fuel to support the physiology so that then the body responds favorably with that. So that's the approach I usually use. And usually that experiment does work. All right. So plant-based protein sources, adequate for building muscle. Any special
Actually,
consideration?
Stacey, can I add one more thing
Yeah,
right
absolutely.
there before you go into plant-based? Which is that there was actually a really good talk on intermittent fast, like that included some intermittent fasting information at the Menopause Society last year. And it was a conversation between one of the heads of the Obesity Medicine Association and a registered dietitian nutritionist as well. And one thing they brought up was that we don't have a lot of data on intermittent fasting in the time of perimenopause and menopause. And this is the time that's already a more stressful time, perhaps higher cortisol levels because of the lack of sleep and everything else. And we don't know what that then fasting and the increased stress on the body from that is then adding to this. So, especially in our perimenopausal, menopausal people, I say, we don't know that this is a good pattern for women in this time of life, and just keeping that in mind. But the other thing that they brought up, which might be helpful, is if you're going to do this type of fasting, a lot of people don't eat in the morning, right? They only eat late at night. And that's actually probably the wrong pattern. That probably the better pattern is to fuel early and stop eating for the rest of the day before you go into bed. So it's just some other things to add into that conversation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's, and as we probably all know, there's so many different ways you can do fasting. I mean, there's everything from like this prolonged nightly fast, which Rebecca's sharing there, which, we probably could all benefit from less late night eating and, longer, maybe being able to sleep longer in the morning so that we don't have breakfast as early, to, some people are doing days of fasting. So there's a whole range there. But
yeah,
that
and I've not, other than a few like promoters, I've not seen good data that the really prolonged fasts are actually very good for you.
It's hard to be active when you're not eating for that. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. All right, so plant-based protein adequate for building and maintaining muscle. Where do we want to start with that one, Beth?
I mean, I think again, we're going to work with our patient and where they're at. If I have a vegetarian or a vegan patient, that's what we're going to work with. Whether they choose that, whether it's something that they're experimenting with, I think that the goal is getting adequate protein, and we can do that in lots of different ways. So we will calculate needs, as I mentioned, based on body weight and goals or activity level, and go from there. So, I always go through, like, to me, it doesn't matter so much if you're getting your protein from yogurt or if you're getting it from chicken or beans or nuts or edamame or cottage cheese, or it doesn't matter to me. In fact, I like the diversity. So the more options we have, the better. We may just have to be a little more strategic if somebody is a vegetarian or vegan, and how do we do that? And how do we optimize their day in getting that protein? So to me, it's completely doable, and any way will work for me, and I'm just here to help figure out, like, how are we going to do that. So I think, in some ways it's easier to navigate if you're a meat eater, and then in other ways I'm vegetarian myself, and so I feel like I have lots of strategies for helping vegetarian and vegan patients as well. So it's really just, what the preference is, and then figuring out how to navigate that, in my opinion.
Yeah, you can definitely do it. We're looking at, and to Beth's point, we want a variety of sources so we get all of those essential amino acids. The research now, we used to think it had to be like combinations, like when Beth and I first started in nutrition school. And it was like, oh, you have to get the beans with the rice and you have to get the grain. There was a little bit more thought on like, let's just we have to eat them together. And now it's more recognized that, okay, as long as you're getting variety, throughout your nutrition pattern, you're going to be able to have all those essential amino acids to be able to build and maintain muscle. And then it is just working with, the patient's needs. I do find, if you have someone that's changing their eating pattern to be vegetarian or vegan, behaviorally that sometimes can be harder if they've been used. Our culture, our American culture, certainly is more protein is more animal forward, and so that transition, it can be harder for those individuals, but not impossible. And then someone that's been doing it for years, often it's easier.
You guys are awesome. I learned so much tonight, and I talk to you every day.
We like talking about this stuff. Thank you for your time, and as always, Rebecca, we appreciate your support in working with us as a team.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. You'll get an email with a link to this, and please feel free to share it out with others who might be interested, and sign up for next month's webinar, which I forget the topic because of course I didn't look ahead because that's the way my day went. Maybe Stacy can pull it up real fast.
I know. I think it's bone. Is it our bone
yes,
physiology?
that's right. Next
bone
month
too.
we're talking bones,
Yeah.
which I know is really important, and a lot of us just don't get enough on. All right, everybody, have a great night, and thank you again to Stasi Kasianchuk and Beth Wolfgram. They were wonderful. Thank you.
Have a good night,
Good
everyone.
night.
Thank you.
I can't end the event.
Oh.
I don't know what's happening.
Let me try.
I have a thing that says end event. Can I press
Me
it?
too.